Thank you, everyone, for coming to our event today. You're at the Transatlantic and Trans-Pacific Dialogue Alliances at Crossroads. My name is Jung Pak. I'm the SK Korea Foundation Chair of Korea Studies here at Brookings. And I'm so pleased to have you join us today. I'm joined by the Institute for European Studies, colleagues from Institute for European Studies, as well as the ASEAN Policy Institute. We cooked up this event and a series of events that, between Ramon Pacheco-Pardo and I, who is the Korea Foundation Chair. In London, we decided that we needed to have a trans-Pacific, transatlantic conversation about Asia issues, alliance issues, and about the Korean Peninsula. This is the second event. The first event was held in Brussels last year. And for this event, we're talking about how 3 years into America First, including the Trump administration's continued criticisms about alliances, how have alliances fared in the past 3 years? How have our allies in Europe and in the Asia-Pacific region, how have they adjusted their approaches, and how do they see U.S. commitment to the region? We will have two public panels. We have two public panels today. First to talk about alliances in the age of Trump, and then to talk about U.S. Alliances in the age of deepening U.S.-China rivalry or strategic competition. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up Ramon Pacheco-Pardo, who will also provide a couple of minutes of opening comments. Ramon?
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for coming. As Jun said, we cooked up this event a couple of years ago. I think it was in London, and last year we held the first one in Brussels, in which we actually discussed, the concern that many European countries have about the state of the transatlantic alliance related to the policy of the current U.S. president, who might be less inclined to support the alliance with the Europeans. But the event last year also served to educate Europeans of the trans-Pacific alliances, which are not as well known in Europe as obviously they are here. So last year's events, I think, was quite successful insofar we got a really good conversation about how these two alliances compare with each other, the current state, how there are many links between the U.S. on the one hand, Europe, Korea, on the other hand, that actually make these alliances resilient. And now we look forward to the discussion, as Jung said, on the third year of America First, and as elections approach here in the U.S. and as in the European Union, we have actually a new commission coming in, a new European Parliament was also voted in, so we have new leadership in the European Union that also has to grapple with the issues that we're going to be discussing today. Thank you very much.
I wanted to invite Che Gang of ASEAN Policy Institute.
Thank you, John. And it is my great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Of course, actually, ASEAN will be hosting the third meeting in Seoul next year. So actually, our intention is to come up with some kinds of recommendation for the incoming administration in the United States to upgrade or strengthen the alliance relation between the two parties. Actually, this one, Transatlantic and Trans-Pacific Alliance, I think the first, maybe the only one we have, talk about alliance issues across the region. So actually we can learn something from the other regions. But actually, it seems that over the past couple of years, we have learned something about what I can call as a kind of Trump risk, how we can effectively manage the alliance relation during the Trump administration, and how we are going to upgrade our alliance relation into the future. That is going to be a very tough challenge ahead of us, but I'm sure that's because of trilateral cooperation among three of us will enable us to provide some kinds of recommendation into the future. But actually, at the moment, alliance, of course, we can underscore the resilience of alliance, but actually there are some problems to fix at the moment and also into the future. But not only the problems, but also what other opportunities we have into the future. That's the area we can discuss in this forum. So I'm very much pleased to host the third meeting in Seoul. Maybe I'm sure I'm relying on my two colleagues to make up some, to come up with some concrete ideas for the upgrading the alliance. I will manage only the administrative staff in Seoul. Thank you.
Thank you. Could I ask the first set of panelists to join us on stage? We have Tom Wright, James Kim, Luis Simon, and myself.
Okay. Okay, sure. Let me introduce the speakers of this panel. On my immediate left, he doesn't need any kinds of introduction. He's a specialist on Trump. So Tom Wright. So on his left, my colleague coming from the ASEAN Institute for Policy Studies, James Kim. He's much more specialized in public opinion as well as U.S.-Korea relations. And on his left is Luis Simon from the Institute of Europe for European Studies from Brussels. So last but least, Chung Bak is going to speak about Korea-U.S. relations as well as more regional issues. Because actually, let me start with questions. Maybe I will ask each of you to speak about overall assessment of the alliance relations after 3 years of Trump administration. And then we can start from there, and then what actually, not only the opportunities, but the challenges we have had over the past 3 years, and also going into the next round. Okay, Tom?
Well, thank you for the kind introduction, and it's great to be here and really great to be part of this terrific joint project. So I think there's a clear sort of narrative arc really to the last 3 years, which pertains directly to the future of alliances. Trump, I think, when he was elected president, came in with a set of visceral beliefs that were unprecedented for any incoming president. You know, he had a 30-year track record of being hostile to alliances, particularly with Korea and Japan, a real hostility toward free trade, particularly anything involving trade deficits, and a general sort of positive feeling about authoritarian strongmen, you know, that manifested itself in different ways. But he had a problem, which was when he was elected, he didn't really have anyone qualified for high office who believed what he believed, and he didn't really have any idea how to convert those instincts into policy outcomes, right? So in that sort of spot he found himself in, he chose people from the business community like Gary Cohn and Tillerson, and from the military side like Mattis, Kelly, McMaster, and others, right, who sort of populated that side of it. And it turned out that they did not really share his beliefs. He just assumed that they would sort of go along with what he wanted, but they were much more mainstream, and they were able to use their knowledge of the policy process to actually pursue a fairly pro-alliance policy, right? And there was a variety of things they did that we can get into if you're interested on that. In Europe, you know, they deployed more troops to Europe, and they obviously had the maximum pressure campaign against the DPRK, and there was a variety of other things that they did. But it turned out Trump wasn't fully happy with that, right? He was frustrated. Around July of 2017, he has a meeting about the JCPOA waiver, and he's really annoyed that, firstly, that there's a meeting, and secondly, that he's forced to sort of stay in it, and same in Afghanistan. And so he begins to push back, and he sort of realizes he's the boss, so he can sort of just say he doesn't have to have a process. So that's what begins to happen. So he starts to push out himself, he tries to be truer to his own beliefs. He replaces all of the sort of so-called axis of adults who can push back on him with people who are either too sycophantic or too weak to push back, right? People who want to go along for their own career advantage, or people who just aren't strong enough to have the weight to push back. He thought he was getting that with Bolton, he didn't, and then he got rid of Bolton, right? But he got rid of pretty much everyone in that regard. And where we are now, essentially, is that he, I think, believes that he has, as someone put it, Politico, this is not the A team or B team, this is the team that says yes, right? It says yes to him, and he believes that he is able to be president to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants in foreign policy. And that makes me particularly worried about the alliances, right? Because the only reason there wasn't a unilateral withdrawal of troops in the Korean Peninsula was because of Mattis, Kelly, and others back in 2018, right? We're now seeing him making decisions on the fly that I think could have grave consequence. And as bad as it is now, I think if there's a second term, all of the things like the future of NATO, whether the US stays in NATO, whether there is an alliance with South Korea and even with Japan, I think all of that is actually fair game and on the table if there's a second term. We just don't know how that's going to go. So the long sort of answer to your very succinct question is I think we're at a point of really unprecedented systemic risk to the alliances, and I think it's largely to do with him as a person, right? There is a whole bunch of other factors that public opinion, long-term trends, shift to Asia to China from Europe, problems in the Middle East, all of those things would be there for any other president, and they would constitute more than enough material for a conference like this or an event like this to discuss at great length. But we need to disaggregate those issues which are challenging from the particular systemic danger, I think, that is there from this particular president. By his own sort of admission, he wants to question this stuff. So I see the alliances basically, post-World War II alliances are probably more vulnerable right now than they ever have been before or than they ever will be in the future, because I don't think we will ever see somebody with this combination of beliefs plus the way they make policy and process information.
That actually scared me.
Sorry.
Anyhow, James, across the Pacific, how you view actually your personal view or maybe general Korean perspective on the alliance, especially the Trump administration?
So picking up where, first of all, let me thank both Brookings and KF for working to make this possible, as well as Ramon and your organization. It's a privilege for me to be sitting on this panel with distinguished colleagues. Just to pick up on where sort of Tom left off on the systemic risks associated with the management of the alliance in the Pacific, I think one of the effects that Trump administration has had in our region is how this has played out in the Korea-Japan relations, right? A lot of the alliance management has been sort of conducted bilaterally. The focus, obviously, it's a new approach. There could be some positive benefits as well as costs to this, but one area that Trump administration has been very different from previous administrations is how it has managed the relationship between Korea and Japan. That there's been very little that the administration has done on that front. And as a result of that, that gave some sort of free license to some of the worst tendencies that you see the allies drawing on. And this is these tendencies, I would say, are stuff that gets in the way of Japan-Korea relations. Tendencies that tap into national identity and history issues. And so part of the reason why we are where we are today on Korea-Japan relations, in my perspective, is largely due to not only what's going on within Korea and Japan themselves, but also what kind of approach the Trump administration has taken with respect to managing this trilateral or three-way relationship between U.S.-Korea, U.S.-Japan, and Japan and Korea. There hasn't been much that's been done there. And so one of the risks is Japan-Korea relations becoming worse, and as a result, that not only having impact on the overall security environment in East Asia, but also on the markets, and what kind of impact that will have on the markets. To a large extent, I think we're pretty much locked in for increased tensions between Tokyo and Seoul until the end of this year. It's anybody's guess what happens next year, but South Korea is in an election cycle. There's a parliamentary election coming up in April, and I don't see the Moon administration changing its position on this issue. On the flip side, though, even with all these risks and sort of potential pitfalls, the alliance has been relatively resilient. If you take a look, the Trump administration has taken a new approach on North Korea. Yes, you can criticize the approach, but there's been fairly good support in South Korea for the Trump administration's approach on North Korea since early in 2018. Okay, so the Koreans have a favorable view of the United States and President Trump in comparison to other countries like China, Japan, and North Korea. They have a favorable view of President Trump in relation to President Xi, Prime Minister Abe, and Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un a little bit more favorable for the Koreans, South Koreans, after the Singapore summit. In fact, the second most favored leader. That's never been the case before that, ahead of President Xi Jinping. So it's a different world we're in. Part of that, to some extent, is due to how the Trump administration has managed the North Korean issue. Second is, despite the fact that there's been a sort of a transactional bilateral approach to U.S.-Korea relations and U.S.-Japan relations, it has remained relatively, manageable. If you take a look at South Korea, the KORUS trade agreement was redone. We had a one-year agreement on the special measures on burden sharing last year. We're in the midst of another round of negotiations. We just began just this month, and we'll see where this ends up, whether we will get an agreement beginning of next year, which coincides with the election cycle. There's another outstanding issue having to do with OPCON transfer. How all of these issues, how it's managed, what kind of impact that will have on U.S.-Japan relations as they negotiate their, they're thinking about their burden sharing agreement and trade matters as well. So it's a bilateral transactional approach. There isn't really a clear alternative to this approach, but it's sort of worked out to a large extent. South Korean public has a relatively favorable view of the bilateral relationship with the United States. Their view of China is more contentious, and part of that, thankfully, has to do with Beijing's approach to managing its relationship with South Korea and Japan, and also how other countries in the region are managing Australia, Japan, in their relationship with each other and also with Korea. So it's a little bit of a mixed view, where I agree with Tom that I don't know how long we could hold out and keep the ship going, but if it's the same administration after 2020 in Washington, I see, it's going to be very, very challenging. But for now, it's sort of okay. For now, it's
for now
manageable, right?
I will come back to you with some questions about this. You are too much optimistic. So, okay. Now, Simon, please.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Let me perhaps try to bring in a different perspective and try to zoom in beyond Trump and America First, and I'll get to that in a bit, and also try to draw attention to some themes that I believe are common or shared between Europe and East Asia when it comes to alliances. Because my sense is that the U.S.-led alliance systems in Europe and East Asia are indeed experiencing important transformations, but I am just not sure how much that has to do with Trump and America First. I mean, in the academic literature, you have this traditional distinction, sort of dichotomic approach to U.S. alliances in Europe and East Asia. NATO is typically seen as the embodiment of multilateralism, whereas in East Asia you have more hub and spoke systems in the sense that the different allies have deep ties with the United States, which is the hub, but not to each other. But my sense is that these categories are less and less useful today. In fact, I would argue that Europe and East Asia are moving away from multilateralism and hub and spokes, respectively, and trending towards some sort of converging, towards some sort of hybrid alliance structure, in the sense that different U.S. allies and partners, and that applies both to Europe and East Asia, connect through overlapping bilateral, minilateral, because we see a lot of trilaterals in East Asia, but also in Europe, and multilateral initiatives and frameworks to tackle different threats. Of course, in Europe, NATO still exists, and this is not entirely new because, bilateralism was also there during the Cold War, but we're just seeing it more. And today, NATO, of course, continues to exist and to provide a direct formal connection between all U.S. allies. But in recent years, Europe has actually witnessed a proliferation of bilateral and minilateral security initiatives, both within and outside of NATO, such as, for instance, Nordic defense cooperation, the bilateral Franco-British military framework, but also U.S.-Polish bilateral, Polish-Baltic minilateral, and so on. And in East Asia, the hub-and-spoke system is also giving way to growing bilateral defense ties between the different spokes, which were previously much less connected. And also, U.S. allies and partners are cooperating in a number of trilaterals and quadrilaterals. We have the U.S., Japan, Australia, U.S., Japan, Australia, India, the U.S., Japan ROK trilateral, which is now going through a bit of a bump, but it's still there. So we're seeing also greater connectivity within the larger alliance system. And I think my sense is that this sort of convergence towards a hybrid alliance structure that combines elements of multilateralism and bilateralism, if you will, has to do mainly with changes in the regional threat environment in both areas, much more so than Trump. And Trump may have further compounded some of those trends in some instances, but I think this goes beyond Trump. In Europe, for instance, we see a much more diverse threat environment than we did during the Cold War, which was sort of dominated by an overarching threat of the Soviet Union that sort of concentrated the mind of all the allies. And greater threat diversity, I think, is leading different U.S. allies and partners to cluster around sub-regional groupings on the basis of their threat convergence. So we're seeing a lot of Baltic and Polish and Nordic defense cooperation to deal with the deterrence challenge in northeastern Europe. The French are doing a lot more with the Spanish, with the Belgians, with the Italians in Africa, and so on and so forth. And in East Asia, I think we observe the opposite trend, a simpler threat environment, which is than used to be the case, which is increasingly defined by China's geostrategic rise and military modernization. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. A good comparison between the Europe and the East Asia. So I will come back to you some other questions as well. Now, Chong.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody for this panel. This was a great conversation. I think when after the election of Donald Trump, and it coincided with the time that I left the Central Intelligence Agency, where I was an analyst for about 9 years. And sitting at Brookings, judging from the number of delegations and questions that I got from our allies and foreign partners about what's happening, that there was a lot of anxiety in 2017 about what is happening, because so much of conventional wisdom about U.S. foreign policy was being upturned, and there was a really great deal of unpredictability. And I think what Tom had mentioned, the so-called axis of adults, helped to, in certain ways, to try to stabilize some of that. But not much had changed in the past 3 years, in that there's still this constant question about what's happening, and my question always was, I don't know, but it could be X, Y, and Z. And it's our analysis is based on, or trying to be more agile and creative and checking our assumptions about what the alliance relationships are and how this is all going to pan out. But I'd say 3 years on, I think we have a little bit of a what could be called an uneasy stability, right? In that we are more used to unpredictability, so we kind of gird ourselves for the unpredictability, the whiplashing decisions, the overturning of conventional wisdom, of statement or Twitter or tweet that comes out that overturns a lot of things. There's still a lot of anxiety, to be sure, but I think there is I think we're used to the anxiety and we're used to the unpredictability. So I think there's a little bit of adaptation in that. But let's go down to the granular. I think Luis had a great started a conversation about how do we compare and contrast the two types of alliances. And I would say that in terms of a hybrid alliance systems or networks emerging, I think these are not new things, right? But these are things that our allies and partners in the regions, whether it's Europe or in the Asia Pacific, have kind of picked up things from the past. The Quad, for example, was something that they picked up from the past. The South Korean President Moon's new southern policy of engaging more with Southeast Asia, that was also plucked from the past and something that the South Korean governments, previous South Korean governments have thought about at least or had made moves toward. So what I see our allies and partners doing, whether it's Europe and in East Asia, is that they're looking back to the past and exercising some of that muscle memory that they had not used. Engaging, South Korea engaging more with Europe, for example, or South Korea engaging more with the Southeast Asian countries. And so I think in a way that is also transcends and it's beyond Trump. But I think what gave impetus to an intensification of those efforts was this unpredictability. That said, despite the resilience, as James mentioned and others have mentioned, as well as some of the adaptive moves that these countries have made, there are problems, and my colleagues have alluded to this, and it's that China and Russia are exploiting the seams of alliance management, of the president's constant criticisms about alliances. How many things do I have to pay attention to when asked about the South Korea-Japan dispute? Why do we have this? Why do we have NATO? Why do we support NATO? What about the trade deficit? This constant questioning of the value of alliances, I think, has a profound impact on how much this seeps into the consciousness of our allies. And so I think the Japan-South Korea conflict, I think, is part of the alliance mismanagement, that because the U.S. doesn't care, and it's clearly that the U.S. president made such strong statements about not wanting to get involved in those things, that it opens up a lot of space for those disputes to fester and to get worse rather than get better. So I'll stop there and look forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for the excellent opening remarks. Tom, I'd like to throw a question about the resilience of the system in the United States to stand against the unpredictability of President Trump. So actually, across the Pacific, we have become much concerned about President Trump's personal management of issues, and that actually can be translated into unpredictability of policy, and especially in the actual implementation. So how much resilient the system you have in the United States?
I think it's pretty resilient. I think it's stymied sort of what he might have wanted to do at the beginning. Mm-hmm. I think he was willing to put these alliances on the chopping block to some extent, but he wasn't able to do that. I think part of that was because there still is a process, because Congress matters. I agree with what the other panelists have said. I think it is sort of a mixed, story. There are other sort of elements, international dynamics that sort of bolster the alliances. I don't think the U.S. has a good alternative. What Trump views Trump's views on alliances have not really transferred to the rest of the Republican Party. The public has become more supportive of alliances, even as the president has not. So all of those things are true, I think, and they are why we still have a healthy alliance system. My point is just that is not foolproof. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not. Those are very strong barriers, and they help, but they're not insurmountable. And I think if somebody like Donald Trump keeps winning elections on a platform of opposition to alliances, that will have a major impact. You know, that's why I think the next election is so vitally important. And I think, you know, what you saw early on with those cabinet officials was that we were able to tell a story that the policy and tweets are different, right? That was the mantra of 2017-18. Whenever we'd have officials in, they'd always say, well, I don't pay any attention to the tweets. I do my job, and that was the thing. Right now, that's sort of code for I don't pay any attention to the president, which doesn't sound as good, so they say tweets. But that has now merged. You know, the policy and tweets are now much more similar. And so I think what's happening is the levees are being breached a bit. They're still fairly strong. I think the US system overall has been resilient. But it requires people in Congress to actually take advantage of the reprieve that they have from that resilience to actually demand sort of accountability, to insist on a formal process, to insist on certain officials. And there's not a great sign of that yet. So I guess I do take some comfort from the resilience, and I do think the alliances are maybe stronger than we would have thought they might be in November of 2016. But I worry just with this trajectory that we've seen that we're back into a moment now where it really is about one person and what they might do, and then the team, I think, is more inclined to just say, I mean, I would just finish on this. Look at what the Secretary of Defense did, right? When he was asked to transfer money to fund the wall on the Mexican border, right? He took it from Europe and he said, here's the money for your wall. Can anyone imagine Mattis doing that? Anybody? No, it would never have happened. And did Esper do it because he believes in that? No, of course not. He probably did it because, you know, he's not all that experienced as Secretary of Defense go. He owes his job to Trump and he was keen to try to please him. That's the difference between 2019 and 2017.
So, for example, because actually since the departure of the grown-ups, the adults, I think there's a system resilience has become weaker. Can I say that?
Yeah, I think you can. You just did say it. You can't say it.
So weak. Yeah. So that's actually that actually raises a concern over.
So what I think is so interesting is that. Despite, I mean, look at you, all of you in this room, right? To talk about alliances, you know, it was not, you know, it wasn't going to be a snooze fest. You were clearly interested and invested in alliances, and we filled up this audience with standing room in the back. And I think that is one of the very small sign, but not insignificant sign that there is great public interest. And when you look at all of the polls on how Americans feel about or think about about U.S. foreign policy, the vast majority of Americans support alliances. In the recent Chicago poll, it's something like 2/3 of Americans really want strong alliances in East Asia, in Asia and in Europe. 70% believe that the U.S. has a role to play in the world, and 90% of Americans who are polled want there to be free international trade or free flow of goods. So I think from the American public perspective, I mean, I think that's pretty echoed in Europe and Asia as well, that the public supports partnerships, the public supports free trade, the public supports greater multilateral engagement and partnerships because they sense that there is benefit to having those things. And I think that is just one part of the resilience. But I agree with a lot of the panelists here is that this is not something to be taken for granted. Alliances are like marriages, for better or for worse.
But actually, whether the public interest can be translated into real policy, That's another issue, because actually at the end of the day, it's going to be maybe President has the ultimate power to make a decision. So maybe if he doesn't care much about the public opinion, so we have some problems. That can be the case. So let me turn to James about the South Korean public understanding of alliance. Of course, actually 2017, when President Trump mentioned about fire and fury, his popularity went down very much. Actually, even the conservatives were really concerned about the possible use of force by the United States against North Korea. So actually, we were almost against the use of force. But actually, when he switched his position toward more dialogue with North Korea, his popularity went up.
That's right. Traditionally, we've been polling since, 2012 on a lot of these issues. South Korean public opinion on the relative ordering of favorability, if you were to take a look at United States, China, Japan, and North Korea, it was, Japan and North Korea would be at the bottom of that list, and it would flip-flop depending on whether or not you get a history issue that pops up every now and then. But U.S., there's been fairly, very stable support for the United States ahead of China, and China would be, a distant second. But and that's understandable given how much South Korea trades with China. China is the number one trading partner, but also not only trade, but the relationship that South Korea maintains with the United States politically and militarily. So on many levels, this has not changed. By the way, even during 2017. But on the relative favorability of leaders, President Trump was not the most popular guy in 2017 when he was, talking about fire and fury, and there was, just one test after another by North Korea, and the U.S. response has been very, strong. He was, in fact, less popular than President Xi Jinping at one point. But starting in 2018, he's now back up to being the most popular leader in the region. And the least popular currently is Prime Minister Abe.
Unfortunately.
And, as I've said before, Kim Jong-un is the second most popular. If you were to ask some specific questions about where the South Korean public stands on USFK and the alliance, in January of this year, we asked this question when we were in the midst of a burden sharing agreement that went over time into March. It was about 68% support for the presence of USFK in the future. Even after reunification, if you were to ask, would you support USFK presence on the Korean Peninsula? After unification this year, it was about 44%. Last year, in 2018, that was about 49%. Do you trust USFK? 63% trust for the USFK. South Korean views about U.S. nuclear umbrella, 67% support for that. So overall, it's been resilient, but there's been a bit of a slippage, as I mentioned, about U.S. support. And this is the risk. This is one of the risks. So, if you were to ask the same question about presence of USFK on the Korean Peninsula in 2016 to 17, it was low 80s. And 2018, that slips a bit to 76%. And 2019, that goes down to 68. So there's a bit of a slippage. So there's a weakening. The system resilience is weaker, as you both pointed out. But it's not weak enough to break it.
But what is the factor actually contribute to the kinds of dropping of the support?
So obviously, President Trump's sort of new approach to alliance management.
Inter-Korean relations, no?
On the inter-Korean relations, I think there's, part of the reason why it's up as high as 68%, despite what he's said about needing to renegotiate the FTA and also demanding more on burden sharing from South Korea. North Korea is the saving grace there. I think that's part of the reason why it's up at 68%. But on these things like, what's being talked about in the news media, that President Trump would like South Korea to pay, 5 times more than what it's currently contributing for, troops that are based in South Korea, which is going to be very tricky, right? Because I think the total cost is somewhere in the $1.5, $1.6 billion. How do you get the $5 billion for the stationing of the troops there? Do you increase troop size, or do you renegotiate the status of forces agreement? It's not clear at all where this negotiation is going, and would you be able to get the negotiation done by early next year? If you don't, how would that play out in the South Korean public as they're in the midst of an election in April? And how would the ruling party want to use that to their political advantage? So there are a lot of risky these spots of high riskiness, as Tom pointed out earlier. But again, as I've said before, we still haven't gotten there yet. We've actually managed to get over these hurdles. Albeit in a difficult way, we managed to deal with them. And so the relationship is still very robust, but it's unclear what kind of event would tip this over the edge, and we get some real significant deterioration in the alliance relationship. Let's say in troop reduction of the USFK, or some other areas where, for instance, on North Korea, would Trump administration's approach to North Korea, President Trump's approach to North Korea, be different in 2020 or 2021 compared to what it's been so far? Would he, instead of going back to 2017 fire and fury, would he be inclined to make a bad deal with North Korea? So these are some of the issues that could potentially be very problematic, and things to think about, but we're just not there yet.
Okay.
So what are the things? A question for James. So what are the things that would make it all come crashing? Like who's holding it up with duct tape and toothpicks? I mean, what is the duct tape and the toothpicks that are propping this mechanism up?
So again, when President Trump had said that he wants to renegotiate the FTA, and I guess the Axis of Adults were able to intervene if we read Woodward's book correctly, and the stories about the things that Gary Cohn had to do to hide that letter from President Trump before it was sent to Seoul as they were renegotiating the FTA. It's the Axis of Adults, I guess, and the bureaucracy and Congress, as well as all kinds of people-to-people relations that are part and parcel of the alliance, and the institutionalization of the alliance, and the Combined Forces Command, UN Combined Forces Command. I think all of these are playing a very significant role. But if we were to, let's say, in the burden sharing agreement, the United States does not play that out very well. When I say the U.S. doesn't play that card very well, come early next year, if the United States continues to insist on a $5 billion contribution from South Korea, without clear justification on where that number is coming from and how South Korea can contribute, and President Moon decides to use this as a political card in order to further bolster progressive sentiments or progressive anti-American sentiments, nationalist sentiments, in order to support certain progressive wing of the party, it could potentially be a very bad, situation we're in.
But actually, I'd like to ask the same question to Simon about how do you view, or Europeans view this Trump's approach toward the alliance, especially from the burden sharing issue? Because actually, when he made a speech at Warsaw, he asked Europeans to increase the defense budget by 2%.
Yeah.
So how do you view the Trump's approach toward the alliance?
Yeah. Let me perhaps say a couple of things on resilience and public opinion, and then turn to that question. I mean, if I say that the current U.S. administration does not have a stellar reputation in Europe, I'm of course not revealing any state secrets. In fact, the European Union in particular has, in recent years, in the last few years, sort of pushed this notion of strategic autonomy, right, of European strategic autonomy, particularly over the last 3 years since the publication of the European Global Strategy in 2016, which is a notion that sort of precedes Trump, but has been politically fueled by this feeling of growing uncertainty in Europe about Trump's commitment to European security, and the fact that, to go back to your question, that even though the deep burden sharing conversation has been introduced both in Europe and East Asia, it has been pushed much more aggressively in Europe, right? The sense is that the United States is prioritizing East Asia over Europe. But it also has to do with Trump's constant criticism of the European Union itself as an institution, right? Which is news, because historically the United States has been one of the staunchest supporters of the European integration process, and that seems to be in question right now. Having said that, I would argue that this push towards greater European strategic autonomy, which comes partly in reaction to all of these uncertainties associated with Trump and the current administration, so far is primarily confined to the rhetorical realm, right? For instance, many European countries, particularly those in Central and Eastern Europe, still continue to see the United States as the only reliable guarantee of security on the continent, especially as Russia sort of continues to flex its muscles. So I think Europeans are able to distinguish between all this uncertainty and unpredictability hype, which is associated with the short term, with a sort of distinguish that between the deep-seated perceptions about the credibility of American power and America's role in Europe. And I think they also distinguish between Trump's rhetoric and his actions, because actually the Trump administration, and that may very well have to do a lot with Mattis and with the Pentagon itself and with the bureaucracy that you were alluding to earlier, but the Trump administration has actually reinforced America's military presence in Europe in the last 3 years, right? In many ways. But beyond those considerations, and sort of going back to the main theme of both alliances and trying to look for connections, there is a lot of discussion in Europe these days about what America's adoption of a sort of China first or even Asia first approach to foreign policy, if you will, means for the transatlantic relationship, what it means for European security, what it means for America's commitment in Europe. And I think this is new, and this is quite new to us, because Europeans are sort of accustomed to be at the center of global politics and at the center of U.S. grand strategy, or they have been at least for the past decades or even centuries. And this is now changing. And as the U.S. focuses more on competition with China, and particularly in the Indo-Pacific theater, there's a growing sense that Europe is becoming a sort of secondary theater, both in global politics and in the context of U.S. grand strategy. And I think this could have implications beyond resource availability, because it also means that considerations related to competition with China and East Asian geopolitics will become increasingly relevant in transatlantic relations. And we're beginning to see this in the context of the EU-US relationship, but also in the context of NATO, where the China theme has suddenly picked up over the last year, sort of popped out of nowhere, and is now increasingly occupying conversations in that context.
But actually, it seems to me that during the Obama administration, we heard the rebalancing and pivot. So it seems to me Indo-Pacific is Trump's version of this pivot. So it's not really new.
No.
So, but what was the U.S. reaction to the pivot or rebalancing?
Yeah, so there was already a lot of hype about that back then, particularly after the Defense Strategic Guidance in 2012 was published, which announced the rebalancing towards the Asia Pacific, then called Asia Pacific. But that sort of subsided after Russia's annexation of Crimea, right? That sort of changed things, and it made that conversation sort of go away. And in fact, a lot of Western Europeans who were complaining about the rebalance in 2012, 2013, were then in 2014, 2015 telling the United States, don't push it too much towards Russia. So, Europe always sort of follows a damned if you do, damned if you don't approach towards the United States, right? If you engage too much, it's because you engage too much, and if you retrench, it's because you retrench. But that sort of went away because there was much more focus on Europe 2014, 2015, 2016 with the NATO Warsaw Summit, even 2017. But then you had the national security strategy, and particularly after the Mike Pence speech at the Hudson Institute, the conversation sort of came back, right? The sense that the United States was prioritizing Asia once again sort of came back, and in a different manifestation, if you will, because now a lot of conversations are about China's growing influence in Europe and China's ability to sort of lever its economic weight to strengthen its diplomatic and political influence in Europe.
And Chung, can I ask you a question about how much serious is the U.S. about the Indo-Pacific initiative or strategy?
I think it depends on who you ask. I think some would say that it's a program and an initiative versus a strategy. And I think from South Korea's perspective, there has been less appetite to go with Indo-Pacific because of the perception that this is specifically targeting China or containing China, and South Korea's desire to maintain at least some sort of neutrality in dealing with in its economic security relationship with China versus the security relationship with the U.S. So I think that that Indo-Pacific is not going to go away. It's whether it was called the rebalance or the pivot or now the free and open Indo-Pacific. But I think one of the things that that the Trump administration has been trying to do is that this is about values, about rule of law, about these broad overarching views goals that the regime can glom onto. I think a lot of if you ask any of our allies and partners, that they would say that it's in the implementation that's always been sketchy or scattered or confusing, in large part because of some of the things that the president himself is doing. Really undermines a lot of the things that at least the bureaucracy is trying to advance on the Indo-Pacific, which should be very compelling, that everybody could be able to glom onto. I did want to ask Luis and others a question though about what in looking at do we see, and you've written about this before, Luis, is the EU-Asia connection. So you talked about concern in the European countries about the focus turning toward Asia and less so on Europe. Whereas I think the Asians would say it's always Europe.
Yeah.
So I just wonder, we saw the EU come out with a statement on or a policy or white paper on China recently, and do you see more efforts by the European governments to try to connect with Asia as a whole?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a good question. Going back to the fact that you always complain that Europe, the U.S. has a Eurocentric approach. It's just that none of us can get enough of the U.S. I guess. The China question, the China conversation is picking up big time in Brussels, in EU circles. You alluded to the fact that the EU put out a communication in which it referred to China as a systemic rival, but also other things. I think my sense is that there's no unified European approach towards China. As far as the connection with Asia is concerned, yes, it is much more deeply felt. But of course, Asia is, not necessarily as a partnership, because Asia as a continent and different Asian powers are much more deeply felt. Perhaps focusing specifically on the EU ROK relationship. I think, and going beyond the specificities of all these strategic partnership agreements and economic partnership agreements and so on, I would argue that, for instance, if you pay attention to the EU's public narrative, what you hear is that one of the things that the EU and South Korea sort of have in common is that they reject this frame of Sino-American competition, right? That they don't want that to be the compass of their foreign policy. And they reject that frame because it sort of imposes a binary choice on them, right? And they'd much rather talk about preserving the multilateral rules-based order than talk about great power competition, right? Because that sort of brings up the question of how are you going to position yourself in the context of Sino-American competition. And the EU, in the EU you hear a lot about the need to, yes, reject that frame and then try to build up again sort of a multilateral rules-based order 2.0, so to speak. I'm a bit skeptical about whether you can do that, given the current climate in Sino-American relationship. I often say that Europeans might not be interested in Sino-American competition, but Sino-American competition is definitely interested in them, right? And I think that also applies to a lot of East Asian countries. And I don't know to what extent the EU and the ROK are powerful enough to reject that frame of Sino-American competition, let alone propose an alternative organizing framework, which does not mean that they should stop trying, but I think they have to grapple with it because it is coming and it is coming to Europe.
So anyhow, I think it is inevitable for Europe and Asia or South Korea to accept Sino-US rivalry as a given factor, and then maybe think about how we are going to cooperate within that framework as a given factor. So that's the area of cooperation between Europe and Asia to find a third way, different way, as you mentioned about multilateralism or minilateralism. But it seems to me that there's no strong connectivity between Europe and South Korea, unfortunately, especially in security dimension. Maybe trade is the area we can cooperate to, but about the security dimension, I don't know what other issues we can discuss between Europe and Asia. Is there any? Do you have any recommendation to make?
I would, by and large, agree with you. But perhaps some nuances here and there. I think I would distinguish between the global level of analysis when it comes to EU-ROK relations, meaning strengthening the multilateral rules-based order in key areas like trade, but also proliferation, environment, and so on and so forth. And I think that level of analysis, the global, offers a lot of opportunities for cooperation between the EU and the ROK, not least because we're pretty much on the same page on a lot of these things. But also between the EU and other U.S. allies in East Asia, like Japan, for instance, who also faces a similar predicament when it comes to Sino-American competition, although with its own specificities. But my sense, and I guess this is where I agree with you, is that as we move on to a much more competitive geopolitical environment and geostrategic environment, European and East Asian countries will worry primarily about the strategic balance in their home regions, right? And that means that they will not have that much bandwidth to cooperate with each other. Yes, security in the transnational domain, and the Indian Ocean perhaps is a meeting place for the two countries. But my sense is that as the security situation in Europe and East Asia worsens, if we indeed accept that assumption, there will not be that much bandwidth. And our main connection is actually likely to remain our alliances with the United States.
Okay, Tom, can you tell us about how Trump administration will approach this minilateralism or multilateralism? Because I have seen anything positive from the Trump administration about the minilateralism or multilateralism. It has been dealing with issues in purely bilateral mode, U.S.-Korea, U.S.-Japan, or U.S.-China. So I haven't seen any kinds of connectivity among these relations. is it going to be the same way into the future or different?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they think of it in terms of unilateralism and multilateralism. You know, I mean, obviously, you know, I think they've limited bandwidth to think about these issues in general, and to the extent they have thought about them, it's the great power competition frame, right? That's how they sort of see it. And so I think cooperation multilaterally comes into the picture. You can make a compelling case to them that they have to work with the Allies and with Europe to have a common position toward China. Right now, the president doesn't really buy that, but most of the administration officials do, I think. And so that's sort of the route in. Are there problems with that? Yeah, you know, definitely. But I think that is the way into it right now. I'd just like to make one point on just on the Europe side of this. You know, I think the reality is that countries, you know, won't have to choose in the sense of abandoning all relations with one and going all in with the other, but they will sort of have to choose in a way that they didn't have before. And 5G is like the perfect example of that. I mean, European countries and allies in Asia too are being forced to make a choice, and the choice about whether or not you think your 5G, you know, investment or Huawei investing in your 5G infrastructure is a problem really comes down to sort of a worldview question about whether or not you think China's intentions could change in the future in a way that would really jeopardize your security. So it's really a sort of theological debate about the nature of the world and the nature of rivalry. And, you know, the American view is that, you know, you do have to make that choice, and actually you need to be skeptical of China's rise in that regard, and you need to hedge against it now by not having sunk costs in that could not be recouped later. That choice, I think, is unavoidable, and by not making the choice, European countries and others are making the choice. You know, by saying that they're going to wait and see means that they are actually making those sunk costs. And I think there has been a shift in Europe over the last couple of years. I think you can have these conversations with European officials in a way that might not have been possible. And it's, you know, complicated, and the decisions aren't coming out necessarily as we would like, you know, all the time. But I think that there is a greater sense of realism there. I think the other point I would make just is, I think when we talk about cooperation between Europe, say in the ROK, or Japan or others, it's easy to default into the what can Europe do in the South China Sea or East China Sea, or what can Europe do in that theater, or what can Korea or others do in Russia, and the answer is, you know, not that much. But a lot of this is actually global. I mean, the security competition is regionally focused, but the technological issues, which are increasingly the center of gravity of this competition, are global, and those standards problems are uniform basically across countries. The assault on sort of the rule of law, on human rights, on core values, those are global issues. How much we make of what's happening in Xinjiang or Hong Kong is as much an issue in Berlin and Paris and London as it is in Seoul and Tokyo, right? So there's a lot of different cross-cutting issues that I think would benefit from a global a discussion between the allies. And I would just mention one sort of seemingly potentially wacky idea that been throwing around recently, but I think there's a case actually for South Korea, for Australia and others to make a bid to join the G7, to expand out that G7 to like a G11 or G12 of like-minded democratic countries that have sort of the same sort of shared interests and values, that can be a counterweight to this sort of neo-authoritarianism that we're seeing. It would be substantively different from the G20. We need the G20 as the forum where all the major economies come together regardless of governance type. But I think actually expanding out the G7 would be a way of ensuring a global multilateral or minilateral forum that could bring together all of the different allies with the US to actually have these conversations on these global issues, and then also to focus maybe occasionally on regional security issues as they arise. So I'm all in for South Korea to join the G7, basically. And Australia.
So I think, has anybody taken a CPR class? Anybody? No one? Thank you, Andrew. I knew you would. So I learned in my CPR class that if you're in charge and you're trying to resuscitate this person, you have to like slap them around. Slap them around, and you have to say, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And you have to really shake them, not like, "Oh, hey, are you okay?" But then it's more like, you really have to get in there and slap. So, but when you need help, somebody to call 911 and somebody to do the AED thing, get the AED machine, you have to actually look at some person in the eye and say, "You call 911," and then you get the AED. So, I have a point, and it's that who's going to take the lead on these things, right? So on tech, on climate, on all these things that the U.S. used to be part, in driving it. So who's going to say you? Is it going to be Germany that takes the lead on climate, tech issues? Is it going to be the UK? Is it, who is it going to be? So I just wonder. So when you have when we talk about alliances, alliances are a composite of different countries with different interests and threat perceptions, et cetera. Who's going to take the lead? And I, Tom, if you could put on your European hat on, and I don't know if it's going to be South Korea. But and Luis as well, like in terms of from the European perspective, who is the lead, and in Asia, who's taking the lead in Asia? I would say probably Japan is taking the lead on a lot of the security and economic issues.
That's right, actually. But on the other, actually, I'd like to come back to the Tom's point about trilateral cooperation, the U.S., Europe, and the Asia's cooperation on these global issues matters a lot. But on the other hand, as Chung mentioned, who is going to take the lead? Some of the regional countries or the United States? Whether the U.S. is in a position to take the lead, all these issues again? Because actually, nowadays, under the Trump administration, we have some questions about the U.S. leadership and credibility.
You're not the only ones.
Okay, of course.
Chung, you point out sort of Japan's role in Asia. The question there is, does Japan want to lead, or is this Japan just hedging the risks associated with dependence on the United States? And you could argue, if you take a look at the Australians, and you want to talk about the Indo-Pacific strategy and the values aspect of that, there's more of an allergic reaction to that, very similar way to the South Koreans. The Japanese, I think, would be more inclined to take on that sort of global agenda. So, not only looking at who's going to lead, but also who will follow is a very important question. But even there, on who's leading at the local, regional level, I'm not sure that that Japan is capable of doing that. And that's not to say that it's not going to have any effect. But just looking at Japan's ability to lead in that region, if it was leading, its approach towards South Korea should be different, but it's not. So I think that there's some limitations to even this kind of replacement leadership as far as East Asia is concerned. It'd be interesting to see what you guys think about Europe.
At that point?
Nope.
Okay. Okay. Now I'd like to open up the floor for questions. Okay. Please identify yourself.
Thank you. Steve Winters, independent consultant. I direct this to John. Admiral Blair said recently that he had heard from many friends in South Korea that the South Koreans were thinking that Japan was hyping the China threat in order to have an excuse to build up their military. And of course, this issue of historical militarism is very sensitive in Asia. So, and it seems like President Trump is very much in the camp of Abe in terms of encouraging this, and also Armitage and Nye in the fourth edition of their report. But so the question is this, specifically, I wonder what the South Korean reaction has been to President Trump's repeated statements that the current Japan-U.S. security treaty is unfair to the U.S. because it doesn't commit Japan to coming to the assistance of the U.S. if the U.S. is attacked. And it's clear what he would like is something like Article 7 in the NATO treaty. But this would be an incredible. So he said this several times. It must have gotten some reaction in South Korea because it plays into this whole issue of are you going to see Japanese troops fighting all over Southeast Asia again?
John, may I collect a couple more questions? If not,
No, we have.
oh yeah, here and there and gentleman in second row.
Chris McRae. So, in your discussion, there seemed to me quite a lot of sort of conflict variables which haven't been included. So, let's take, energy exports. Saudi, Russia, US, I think they're about 75% of all energy. Now, how does this sort of fit with all of your alliances? Because if they are that much energy, that plays the game. Or we haven't really talked about India and China, that each 1/5 of the whole world's population. If America always being greatest means that China can never, or India can never be more than 1/3 of the wealth of Americans, again, that does not seem to be something that is sustainable long term and is sort of. So how does this fit into your sort of alliance framing of things when there are these big variables which sort of don't fit at all with the, if you like, the geographic way you're framing it?
Okay, gentlemen, the fourth row.
My name is Elliot Hurwitz. I just want to thank the panel for a very good presentation. The term strategic autonomy was mentioned in the discussion. I would like anyone on the panel, please, to define what does strategic autonomy means.
Okay, thank you. Simon?
Take that
Yes.
right away. That's a very good question. The EU uses that word quite often, but there's no agreement whatsoever on what the definition is. In any case, autonomy is not like. It's not a binary concept. It's not like pregnancy that either you are or you are not. You can be more or less autonomous. You're never fully autonomous, right? Not even the United States needs partners and allies to accomplish many things. I guess this, in a European context at least, this concept is used primarily in relation to reducing the existing dependence on the United States and on NATO specifically, particularly when it comes to conducting. The meaning has been changing, right? It started to be used in the late 1990s when the EU launched a common security and defense policy, and back then it was used in the sense of the EU should be able to conduct low to medium level of intensity expeditionary operations without resorting to NATO's command and control infrastructure, therefore U.S. assets. And now strategic autonomy is used much more broadly. For instance, one of the consequences of this use of strategic autonomy is the EU's push towards greater European defense industrial cooperation and industrial and technological autonomy. And sort of there's this notion of the EU emerging as an autonomous pole that sort of rejects the frame of Sino-American competition that I was alluding to earlier. So to sort of recap, I don't think there is any sort of agreed definition on what strategic autonomy means, but in a European context, those are sort of the parameters of the discussion, if you will. Yeah.
Okay, Chong, can you?
I don't know. I mean, I would ask you, James and Kang, to pipe in too. Is that
I'm moderator. You are the panelist.
Because you just came from Korea.
Okay.
So on the this conspiracy that we've created the China threat, or that Japan is amplifying the China threat to undermine South Korea, I think it's a little far-fetched. But I think what that speaks to is that that South Korea and Japan have fundamental differences in how they want to see and how they want to deal with China. And so, that's one of the problems of the region, is that, or having collective leadership, or having one country take the lead, is that we all have we might have similar values, but we have different ways of looking at the strategic threat. For South Korea's part, I think the tendency is to try to be the middle player, and to and the fact of the matter is, South Korea is very dependent on China. And what James, you mentioned how if Japan wanted to be a leader, that the relationship with South Korea wouldn't be this way. I think similarly, the logic for South Korea is to cooperate more with Japan to reduce its dependence on China, but that's just not the case. Which is another example of how countries don't necessarily act in strategically or security logical ways.
Okay.
Well, I mean, just to add to Jung's point, Steve, I would ask Admiral Blair, which half of Korea are you talking to? Because South Korea, it seems to me, is split on this issue about Japan, even. If you were to ask the South Korean general public, or even for that matter, the elites, do you value security cooperation with Japan? Somewhere between 52 to 54% of the South Korean public would say that, yes, security cooperation with Japan is good for South Korea's national interest. So there's the other half, obviously, that would say, no, it's not. Perception of China as a threat. If you were to ask the South Korean public to choose between China and the United States, 70 to 80% would choose the United States as a natural military partner and also an economic partner over China. But if you were to ask, what do you think about the US-China trade war and its impact on South Korea's national interest, 75% would argue that it's not good for South Korea's national interest. So, this gets back to the point that was made earlier, I think, by both Luis and Tom. What's the strategy here? How are we going to address this issue as this strategic competition between US and China? Because if we're clear on the strategy and the path forward, then Koreans can say, oh yeah, we're on board with that, or we're not on board with certain aspects of that. So, you could criticize the administration right now in Washington for not having clarity on the policy, as some people say there's no clarity. On the other hand, you could argue that there's something there. I guess we would continue to push on exactly what that is. And I think the South Koreans, even both on left and right, are asking this question: what is the Indo-Pacific strategy exactly, right?
Yep. Actually, let me answer the question. Actually, of course, there used to be kinds of argument like that. Japan is using China's threat as to justify its military buildup. Maybe there's still some argument like that in Seoul. But actually nowadays, South Korea is so much concerned with the rise of China in its military dimension. Last year, China actually violated air defense identification zone 20 times. And this year, up to now 19 times, actually, Russian aircraft violated our own airspace. So actually, South Koreans have become much more concerned with the military power of China. So Chinese military buildup is different from Japanese military buildup. Of course, we are concerned of a Japanese military buildup, but actually when you come to the actual figures, it's a different story. Well, the Japanese side has acquired, of course now some people argue, Japan is going to acquire more F-35 and then going to have more airborne refueling system to increase power projection capability, blah, blah. But now the most discussion is on China. So South Korea has become much more concerned with China. That's a trend we have in Korea. So that's why, of course, we have not, of course, if you look at some literature in South Korea about Chinese military threat, you can find very few. But behind the scene, you will hear lots of discussion going on, the meaning of China's rise, not only economy, but also the military dimension, very much. That's the thing. But about Indo-Pacific, I think South Korea finally endorsed Indo-Pacific because it sees some common element between Indo-Pacific Initiative and New Southern Policy. But I have some question whether South Korea will go beyond the trade and economy and joining the maybe security cooperation in more non-traditional security dimension or not. I'm still not so much convinced whether South Korea will go along with the United States or Japan or India in realizing Indo-Pacific strategy. The next step is going to be how you are going to institutionalize the Indo-Pacific strategy. Unlike BNR, Indo-Pacific far behind the BNR, because BNR has already established its own mechanism, as AIIB is one example. China is pushing to introduce other different mechanisms to back up the BNR. But how far United States will go in implementing or realizing the Indo-Pacific strategy, whether what's new in Indo-Pacific strategy compared to the rebalancing strategy of Obama administration. That's the question I have. So there's, actually, Tom, you were going to say.
Oh, I can wait till the next round.
Okay, sure. The lady in the middle.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Alice Panier. I'm at Johns Hopkins SAIS. That was me, right?
Oh, yeah.
Actually, just following up on this conversation. So I'm a Europe specialist, so it's really interesting to have this conversation for me, really enlightening. So my question may be a little bit obvious, but you've mentioned the worst case scenario of a second Trump mandate, but what if it's a Democrat who comes to the White House in 2021? What can we expect in terms of China strategy coming from the Democrats? And what sort of common approach could they develop with that takes into account the local concerns of Japan and Korea? So that kind of links with your last question.
Thank you. Gentleman in the back.
Stanley Kober. In his farewell address, President Washington advised the American people not to make alliances permanent. Alliances, he said, should be temporary arrangements to deal with an emergency and should be dissolved once the emergency is over. Why, in your judgment, was President Washington wrong?
That's for everybody. Okay, gentlemen in the white shirt.
Oh, yeah, Carl Polzer. I'm just wondering how tied the U.S., South Korea, and Japan really are militarily. In other words, if you think forward about 20 or 30 years and the U.S. wants to detach, at some point they have to go beyond, giving them planes. They either have to arm them with nuclear weapons, because the only deterrent that those two countries have against China and North Korea is ultimately nuclear. So how can we not be there? I mean, that would totally upend the whole region, and so aren't we kind of tied there?
Okay, we have 3 questions, and okay, Andy.
Hi, Andrew at Catholic University. Jung, don't expect me to save anyone if anyone's choking. My question is directed more at Luis. It's about regional leadership and regional hegemony. So in Asia, there's more contestation about who might become the leader in the future between China and the United States. But in Europe, I'm wondering if that's less of a concern, and so if the U.S. withdraws, if that's okay, because in Europe you still have the European Union. That doesn't mean the EU is united on all fronts, but you don't have that dynamic where there's another power that's gunning for leadership. Perhaps Russia, maybe, but they're still, in my opinion, on the periphery. So I was wondering if you could just comment about any sort of leadership struggle within the European space.
Okay, now who can answer the questions? Okay, Tom?
Just a few thoughts. The first is just on European strategic autonomy. The best description I ever heard of it was it's a conference-building measure. So it's designed to be discussed at great length. And just on Trump and Japan, he was saying that on Japan, on the mutual defense side, for years. Like the first time I got interested in what Trump was saying on foreign policy, I saw him on TV in a debate or a rally in Iowa in 2015, I guess, and he was talking about that treaty with Japan and how it was unfair. And I was completely confused as to how he even knew about it. But it turns out that it's part of this decades-long antipathy toward alliances. So it's not new. Just on the question about Democrats, I think it's really a tale of two camps, right? So if there's somebody like Biden or somebody like that, I think it's quite predictable. You'll see a pretty robust sort of China strategy with all of the different elements of that, including in the security competition side. But the big difference from Trump will be working very closely with allies and all of the sort of critiques that have been made of the Trump strategy by sort of mainstream analysts. I think if it's Sanders or Warren, I think it's different, and it's also sort of interesting. Both of them have folded China into this worldview that sees democracies vying with authoritarian governments for sort of control of the international order. And so they're both very much on the record as taking a fairly tough stance on China. But there's going to be ambiguity about the degree to which they want to lean into the security competition side of that, or that they think that can be contained to other spheres like economics, which is their main focus. So I would anticipate some ambiguity and maybe even some disagreement about that and what it means to have sort of a credible forward power projection capability in the Indo-Pacific. And the final question just on Europe, I think it's very different, Andrew, if you look at what would happen in Europe. It's not that Russia would achieve hegemony, although I think they would dramatically increase their influence. I think the debate is whether or not a US withdrawal from NATO would really exacerbate internal stresses in Europe that would result in sort of negative trends across a range of areas. So what would the impact be on democracy and the rule of law in parts of Eastern and Central Europe, for instance, and in Western Europe for that matter? Would it empower sort of more nationalistic forces in Western Europe that might be less willing to cooperate with the United States, like the AfD in Germany or Front National in France? And then crucially, what does it do to Europe's strategic orientation in terms of working with Russia and China? Does Europe, to the extent it's united at all, become sort of an entity that sees the US as just one option amongst others and it will just play all sides because there's no alternative? Or is it sort of an anchor for liberal order? So those of us who sort of look at Europe would say it would be a strategic catastrophe for the US to disengage, because you would basically potentially lead to the unraveling of that European order in a world that's already, very problematic for sort of democratic and free countries.
Luis?
Yeah. Let me perhaps start with the George Washington question. I wouldn't say that he was wrong. It's that just he was looking at it from a very different platform. It was a platform of a republic that had just achieved its independence, and today the United States is a global superpower with extensive economic, security, and political interests in multiple regions. And I would argue that its alliances are very instrumental in terms of helping the United States secure or advance those interests. Having said that, the specific value of individual alliances does change as a function of a dynamic geopolitical and geostrategic context. So I guess the broader Washington point stands, from that perspective. On the Europe question, thank you very much for asking me to air the dirty laundry of intra-European struggles on the record. No, but seriously, I think you're right. In East Asia, you do see a comprehensive cross-domain challenge to the regional balance, in the sense that you have China that it is not only strengthening its position, its regional position in the military strategic domain, but also in the economic domain, and also diplomatically to some extent, sort of leveraging its growing military power and economic influence. You do not have such a situation in Europe, and that is partly, I would argue, why the United States prioritizes East Asia over Europe, right? Because you do have Russia sort of posing a military challenge, but it's not a military challenge. It's not challenging the regional balance. I mean, it's posing, and this is recognized in the NDS itself, that Russia does pose a threat to U.S. allies, but does not pose a threat to the overall balance. It could. I agree with Tom. It could, but at present it really does not. And you have, one of the reasons is that you still do have NATO, and European countries by themselves do have still formidable, at least technological capabilities and the potential to balance against China without the United States, should they wish to do so, which is an entirely different question. And then in the economic domain, you have Germany / the European Union. Yes, they're influential, but they don't dominate, and in the EU, decisions need to be negotiated with other powers. So you have I agree with you. You basically have a very different, a very asymmetric picture from the viewpoint of U.S. grand strategy and U.S. interests.
James?
I guess I'll just add that, going back to more recent past history, instead of the founding of the country in the U.S. In '92, I think there was contemplation of a stage pullout from Korea because the strategic environment had changed, right, in the early '90s. But it's interesting that we're at where we are today, and some of those challenges haven't gone away. Part of the reason why I think the alliances still remain intact, and it's evolved in some ways, as Luis pointed out, that we don't have a peace deal with North Korea yet. We don't have that Korean Peninsula issue settled. China is now a strategic competitor. And Russian issue is it's not gone. So some of those similar challenges, I think, they're still lingering. And I guess the question is, for not only for the United States but also for the allies in the region, are these emergencies sort of are they gone, or are they still there? Using sort of your quote that you mentioned earlier about the emergencies requiring the alliances, and if that's the case, you could very well argue, using Washington's logic, that some of these similar problems are still there and that needs to be dealt with.
Okay.
I think the second question answered the first question, right? I mean, the fact is that South Korea and Japan live in a really terrible neighborhood with terrible neighbors, and I think maybe you were asking what are the possibilities of South Korea and Japan going nuclear, and I think there's the Special Representative Steve Biegun mentioned that recently about what happens if North Korea stays nuclear, that we have the potential for nuclear proliferation in the region. I think yes, that's always a possibility, but I think and the reason that South Korea and Japan have not gone nuclear, which they could very easily, is because of the strength of the U.S. commitment. But I also I don't want to downplay the threat of nuclear proliferation in the region, but I also think that there are constraints on those countries from going nuclear, and that is the reputational cost. I think there's going to be a not in my backyard kind of movement. Japan obviously has a really terrible history with nuclear weapons. There could be sanctions that get activated as a result of if South Korea and Japan go nuclear, or Taiwan, for example, or as another. Finally, that's bad for everybody because it explodes the concept of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, in which it's a near unanimous international treaty to stem the flow of nuclear and fissile material and others, to make sure that we have a stable international environment. So I think there are big constraints on South Korea and Japan going nuclear.
But I was going to raise a question, because actually I have never seen any conference which has not covered North Korea. But this is the first one. We have not, actually, all the way up to now, we have not touched upon North Korea. We have not used the word North Korea at all.
I said DPRK once.
I mentioned it also.
Okay,
yeah.
but anyhow, I was going to raise, because America First policy in 3 years, because actually one of the issues Trump administration has dealt with was North Korea. Has been any kinds of progress, whether it's been successful, and what is your outlook, actually, especially Chung? I'd like to have your take on.
You're saving that for the last question?
Yes.
James mentioned North Korea on the polling and the popularity of President Trump. What's going to happen with North Korea? So I think that things look good for North Korea in many ways, and it's related to alliances too. In that if China prefers bilateral negotiations because they can move their heft more easily, North Korea also prefers bilateral negotiations and bilateralism because it gives them a chance to exploit national preferences. So, for example, it prefers to talk to China, it prefers to alone, prefers to talk to Russia alone, prefers to talk to the U.S. alone, does not prefer to talk to Japan at all. But you can see the North Korea's own hub and spokes way of dealing with its neighbors. What is disheartening on the North Korea issue is that when the U.S. president himself criticizes alliances, when South Korea and Japan are quibbling about trade and economic issues as well as military issues, and China's kind of sitting back watching all of this, it doesn't really strengthen the sanctions regime or strengthen our hand when it comes to negotiating with North Korea. For North Korea, it's better for us to be divided than united, because all of these things take a lot of effort, and even the show of unity goes a long way in showing North Korea that they can't have it their way. So we'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I am personally concerned with maybe some adjustment of ROK-US alliance is faster than the denuclearization process, because actually President Trump unilaterally announced that they actually scaled down or termination of joint military exercise. I don't know whether we maintain the same level of military preparedness. That's a weakening sign. So that's bad, actually, in the eyes of North Korea. They can say, we can exploit that aspect very much concerned with that. So I hope we can review the robustness of alliance stature and joint military preparedness level very much. So please join me in thanking the panelists for the excellent presentation and answers.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.